So the next hero class we're going to talk about is the Rogue. Now the Rogue actually has an interesting class mechanic like the Shaman. They're the two classes in the game that have specific class mechanics. And the Shaman's being overloaded, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Shaman. But the Rogue uses a combo effect for its class mechanic. Now what the combo effect is and how to use it, it's actually very easy. Let's take a look at one of the cards here and I'll explain it to you. Now basically what a combo effect is that a lot of the Rogue cards will have a base effect and a combo effect. Now how you play these combo effects is simply by playing a card before you play the card with the combo effect. So for example, this Cold Blood card that costs 1 mana. Now if I wanted to put this on one of my creatures, I would play it for 1 mana. And if it's the first card I play, it would give that minion a +2 attack. Now if I play a card before this card, it triggers the combo effect, so instead I get a +4 attack on that creature. So that's basically the gist of how the combo mechanic works for the Rogues, and I'll go into it a little bit more in depth on some of the specific cards when we get to them. But that's the basic behind it. So the first thing we're going to cover with the Rogue is some of its removal cards, what I think about them, which are the better ones, and how you should use them. So the first card we're going to cover here is Backstab. Now Backstab is a 0-cost card that does 2 damage to an undamaged minion. Now that's the important part of the card to always keep in mind. When you want to use this card against a minion, that minion has to be undamaged. Now Backstab is very good at removing 2-cost minions such as 3/2. What also Backstab excels at is using it on larger undamaged minions and then using a smaller minion to finish it off. So example, you have a couple 3/2s on the board and they throw down a 4/5 Chillwind Yeti, for example. Well, you can Backstab that, do 2 damage to it, bring it down to 3, and then finish it off with one of your 2-cost 3/2 minions. So that's the main key thing with Backstab, is always keep in mind that it has to be an undamaged minion. Once that minion takes damage, it's no longer a valid Backstab target. So the next one we have here is Betrayal. Now Betrayal is an interesting card. I actually like Betrayal. What Betrayal does is it has the minion that you target it with do damage to the minions adjacent to it. So if you have 3 enemy minions on the board and you cast Betrayal on the one in the center, that center minion will do its damage to the minions to the left or to the right of it. Now you don't have to have 3 minions on the board. That's just the optimal setting for using Betrayal. Now you can cast it on 2 minions. You can cast it to the left if you want to take out the center one if you feel it's a more important target. I like Betrayal. I think it's a great card. I typically only carry 1 in my decks though, for the simple fact that optimal situations to use Betrayal don't present themselves as much as you would think using the Rogue deck, and that's because Rogues typically play a little faster. They typically have a little easier time clearing out a lot of minions. So it's a great card, but I wouldn't necessarily carry more than 1 in my decks. I typically only carry 1. I found if you carry 2, a lot of times it's just sitting around in your hand waiting to be used. So it's a great card. Just keep in mind how many you're using in your deck. Eviscerate. Now Eviscerate is probably the best of the Rogue removal cards, and it also affects the combo that we spoke about earlier. Eviscerate is a 2-cost card that does 2 damage. However, if you combo it out by playing a card before it, it combos out for 4 damage. So Eviscerate is a great card for doing a lot of damage to some of these bigger, beefier creatures like a 4/4 Dark Iron Dwarf, or even whittling down some of the even larger creatures than that and then finishing them off. It's a great card. I almost always carry at least 2 Eviscerates in my deck. Most of the other players, especially in some of the higher end decks I've seen for Rogue, carry 2 Eviscerates. It's one of the best removal cards in the Rogue's arsenal, so I definitely recommend carrying 2 of them unless you have specific kind of deck mechanics where you're looking to replace it with something else. But I think it's a great card. I carry 2 of them. Now Sap is actually an interesting card. There are some uses for Sap. The problem is that at the end of the day you're paying 2 costs mana and a card to put a minion back into your opponent's hand. So the problem with that is they still have that minion, and they're more than able to play it again the next turn. So you've already lost a card against them just for that temporary effect. Now that temporary effect can be useful in certain circumstances. I've found, like, for example, let's say you're ready to win the game, okay, and you just need to push through that last bit of damage, and he throws down a big taunt, and you can't get through it. Well, if you sap that, you can remove the taunt and then do the damage. But you could also theoretically just throw a silence on it and then do the damage. So there are some better options than Sap. Sap's not considered a great card by most of the people in the Hearthstone community. I typically don't carry them. I've just found that the other removal cards, or even having a minion with silence, is usually a better option, and it usually will help you gain board control and be beneficial in other ways that Sap can't do. So now Shiv is an interesting card. It's like Fan of Knives in that it deals 1 damage and it draws a card. Now the problem with Shiv is that it's really not going to be useful in a lot of circumstances because there's not a lot of minions in the game that only has 1 health. Yes, you can use that 1 health to finish off a minion with your weapon, for example. But typically, most players feel that Shiv isn't a great card. It does have the card draw on it, which gives it a little more utility and a little more use. But overall, you're better off picking up some of the other rogue cards. Now, one of the things you can do with Shiv is that you can use it to enrage a creature. That's such as the Raging Worgen or the Gurubashi Berserker. Now that can be very useful, and if you're running some kind of a unique kind of rogue enraged deck, it may be something that you want to take a look at. But other than that, most people aren't running Shivs. I typically don't run it. It's not a outstanding card by any means, so that's something to keep in mind. And the other card I was talking about with that one is Fan of Knives. Now, Fan of Knives, the interesting thing about Fan of Knives is it deals 1 damage to all enemy minions. So it's kind of a Shiv, but it does that damage across the board. But again, the problem is that 1 damage typically isn't enough to finish off very many minions. Now, if you combine this with maybe some attacks or your dagger, you might be able to get some early removal with it. Plus, you do get that card draw. Thing to keep in mind with Fan of Knives, though, is it loses a lot of its value the later the game goes, because that's when the big creatures are coming out. Fan of Knives isn't going to do a whole lot. Early on, it can be a reasonable card to use because of that early card draw and because of the minions having lesser health. But if you're going to carry Fan of Knives, I recommend look towards using them towards the early part of the game. The later it goes on, the less utility you're going to get out of them. Next we have Assassinate. Now Assassinate's a great card. For 5 cost you destroy a minion. And the great thing about Assassinate is, unlike a Hex or a Polymorph, you're not leaving behind a 0-1 taunt, or you're not leaving behind a 1-1 sheep. Assassinate basically just kills the target. You're not leaving anything behind that you then have to deal with. It's a great card. Interestingly enough, I've seen a lot of high-end rogue decks that don't even carry them. They focus more on just getting faster minions out and then using those to deal with anything unwieldy that comes out on your opponent's side. I actually like Assassinate. I think it's a great card to have in there, especially when you're facing something like a late-game Druid deck with those big beefy creatures like 5/10s with taunts or the 8/8 Ironbarks. I like it. I think it's a solid card. I usually carry 2 in a lot of my rogue decks. I really don't see a downside to it other than its 5 cost, but for what it does and that effect, it's a great card. Now, the rogue's actual hero ability, I should say, is being able to summon a dagger, which is a 1 damage, 2 durability dagger. And aside from that, they have the ability to use a few other weapons that are class cards. One of them is the Assassin's Blade. And I think the Assassin's Blade is a very solid weapon. It's a 5 cost, 3 damage weapon with 4 uses. Now, the downside to the Assassin's Blade, of course, is its cost to damage ratio, but you get those 4 uses out of it, which is very nice. You can compare it sort of to something like an Arcanite Reaper, which costs 5 mana as well and has 5 damage, but it only has 2 uses. I love Assassin's Blade, especially if you couple it with something like Deadly Poison, because then you're talking about a 5 damage weapon with 4 uses. Very powerful. The thing to keep in mind with Assassin's Blade, though, is I've often found that usually putting more than one of them in a deck tends to be overkill sometimes. So that's something that you might want to play around with your deck to see what feels right for you with what you're running. I've often found, though, that usually more than one is overkill. But, you know, that's my opinion with the decks I've ran, so you might have a different go with it, but that's what I think of it. The other weapon is Perdition's Blade. Now, Perdition's Blade is interesting because it actually has a battle cry and a combo ability. Now, Perdition's Blade is a 3-cost 2/2 that does 1 damage to a minion or the enemy hero when you play it. Now, the cool thing with this is that it can also be comboed for 2 damage. So, if you play Perdition's Blade, for example, on turn 3, or it doesn't really matter what turn, but you can combo that out for 2 damage on like a 4/4 and then finishes it off with the 2 damage of the actual Perdition's Blade. It's also great for, even if you can't combo it out, to knock things off like the Divine Shield on a Scarlet Crusader. You knock that off and then you finish it off because it's a 3/1. So Perdition's Blade is actually one of my favorite weapons in the game. It's a lot of fun. You can do a lot of things with it. It can be very useful. And of course that 2 damage when you combo it is more than enough to finish off a lot of 3/2s 2-cost minions. So we'll go ahead and take a look at some of the class. Well, you know what, let's go ahead and talk about Deadly Poison real quick since we was covering the weapons. Deadly Poison is an amazing card in my opinion. It gives your weapon +2 attack, and what makes Deadly Poison so strong is that it's 1 mana cost and it's very easy to play, especially on the basic weapon that the Rogue Hero ability gives you. It basically turns that 1/2 dagger into a fiery war axe. So you could theoretically, if you have the coin on turn 2, you could use your hero ability, throw on a Deadly Poison, and pretty much remove anything he can throw out at that point. So I love Deadly Poison. I think it's a great card. I almost always carry 2 of them in my decks. Most players have the same opinion of them. It's a great card. So we'll go ahead and talk about some of the minions in the Rogue class cards. Now the first one I guess we have to talk about is the Defias Ringleader, because it's by far probably one of the most popular cards with the Rogue. And the interesting thing with the Defias Ringleader is its combo ability. And that is to summon a 2/1 Defias Bandit when you play it. Now, one of the strongest opening plays in Hearthstone is considered the coin Defias play. Basically, on 1 mana you can use the coin, which acts as a spell which triggers the combo. So on turn 1 with the coin, you can basically play out the Defias Ringleader, which gives you a 2/2 and a 2/1 on the board. It's a very strong opening. And a lot of players have kind of complained that the coin acts like a spell, but I actually don't think that's going to be changed in the future, because Blizzard's opinion on it is that right now, whether you have the coin or you go first, the odds of winning have become very even, and they're afraid of upsetting that balance by making any kind of changes there. So I really don't think they're going to change that in the future. So this is going to be a viable combo for the foreseeable future. I love the Defias Ringleader. I almost always put 2 of them in my Rogue decks. I think it's a fantastic card. It's a great opener, especially when you have the coin, and it's something I would definitely be putting in my decks. Now, one of the other class cards is the SI7 Agent. Now, the SI7 Agent also has a combo effect. Now, on its face value, a 3-cost 3/3 isn't that impressive, but what makes it so good is that combo damage. So you can play an SI7 Agent and use that 2 damage to knock out another 2-cost minion, or any minion that has 2 health left. You can also use it to knock off things like Divine Shields, weaken a larger minion so you can finish it with a smaller minion. It's just great to have that extra 2 damage to play with when you can combo this card out. Typically when I play SI7 agents, I usually don't keep them in my opening hands. I usually go for something a little cheaper like the Defias Ringleaders because I don't want to play them without using that combo if at all possible. So moving on here, Master of Disguise, it's an interesting minion, and it's a 4-cost 4/4 that gives a friendly minion stealth. Now, it's on its face, it's not a bad card. It's kind of a cool little gimmicky thing, but the fact is that a lot of times it's not going to be that useful. I could see a situation where you maybe have a unstealth minion like a 7/5 assassin, and you want to hide that so they can't be targeted and removed for the next turn or something along those lines, or maybe even something like an Emperor Cobra, which could be very cool, because then you can have like this lurking killing blow minion just waiting to strike. The problem is just on its face, other than giving that minion stealth, isn't really a great card. It's just a 4 for 4/4. It's very general. It's very basic. There are, like I said, certain situations where it might be beneficial to use it, but I think more often than not, you're better putting out something at 4 costs like a Chill One Yeti, something that's going to have more utility and have more effect on the board. It's going to be a little harder to remove. It's not a bad card, but it's not something you're going to see a lot of players, especially at the higher end of rogue decks playing. It's not one of my favorite cards. I think there are more important things to be looking at getting as far as the rares go, like the SI7 agents. By no means it's not a horrible card. It's just nothing really compelling to me. So I'm going to go into crafting mode here because there are a few cards that I don't have anymore, whether I disenchanted them or never got them. I used to have a Patient Assassin. I actually disenchanted it. Patient Assassin is, like I was talking about earlier, it's kind of like an Emperor Cobra, except it has stealth. It's a 2-cost 1/1, but whatever it hits, it will kill. Now, the cool thing about Patient Assassin is it does have that killing blow kind of effect, but the problem is with 1 health, it's very easy to remove with any kind of AoE damage. So yes, you could play this out and hope they figure maybe it's not worth it, but if they think they're going to lose a big creature to this and they have some AoE in their hand, they're probably going to remove it before they play anything of substance. So any kind of like Fork Lightning if you only have 2 minions, or if you just get unlucky, or Chain Lightning, or Flame Strike, or Consecrate, all those things are going to knock Patient Assassin out. So it's really one of those minions that, yeah, it's a cool ability. He does have that stealth, which makes him very cool. But you're going to have to be very aware when you play him and be ready for the possibility that he may be knocked out with AoE. So Kidnapper is actually, I don't consider a very good card. First off, it's 6 cost, it's very high cost, and it's a 5/3. It just doesn't have enough health to make it a valid card when you're putting down a 6 cost card. It's just very easily removed. Now, the combo is kind of cool. It's basically a more expensive version of SAP. And the combo is when you combo this card out, which is going to be harder because it's already a 6 cost card. But when you combo it out, you're going to be able to return a minion to its owner's hand. Now, you could do this to your own minion, but a lot of times you'd probably want to do it to one of their minions to get it out of the way. So like I said, it's basically a more expensive version of a SAP or a Ancient Brewmaster in a way. Personally, like I said, I don't think it's a great card. It is listed as an epic, so it's actually 400 dust to make this. I think there are much better things to be spending that dust on than this. Especially a card with 3 health that can be easily killed off once it is in play. And so it's not a great card. I wouldn't look at making this early on. Now, the class Legendary is actually one of the legendaries in the game that I feel is actually a very solid legendary. It's a good card, and it's actually not overpowered. What it does is when you combo Edwin Van Cleef out, is he gains +2/+2 for every card you played earlier this turn, and it doesn't have to be creatures, it can be spells or whatever. So theoretically, if you play 2 cards before you play Edwin Van Cleef, you're going to get a 6/6. And I think it's a very cool mechanic, and I had actually wished that they had modeled more legendaries in the game off of this kind of idea that, yeah, the legendary should be cool cards with cool abilities, but they shouldn't be kind of game breaking. They shouldn't really overly turn the tide of the game and the match with just one card, like Ysera can, or Jiraxis can with its two mana cost 6/6 every turn. So I wish they had more followed the pattern with something like Van Cleef when it came to the other legendaries. But overall, I think he's a well-balanced card. He's nothing overly phenomenal, but I think he's very solid. It's a good card to have in the decks, especially very fast, small minion kind of aggro decks. You can get him boosted up pretty high. It's a solid card. I wouldn't necessarily look to dump 1600 dust in creating him. I think there are better cards to focus on first, because he isn't that game-breakingly changing kind of card. So, but you know, overall he is solid, and I would just look to unlock him through packs eventually. So that covers most of the minions for the rogues. So let's go ahead and talk about a few other cards and what I think about them, and whether they're good or not. Now, first off, Shadow Step. You're not going to see it much. It's not a card that's played very often. For 0 cost, you return a friendly minion to your hand, and it costs 2 less. Now, there are certain situations that you might want to use something like Shadow Step, especially cards that may have card draw, things of that nature. But overall, you're probably better off just using that card slot for something with a little more utility that's going to have a little bit more of effect on the game. You don't see Shadow Steps being played very often. I typically don't run with any of them. I find it's of limited use, especially you want to typically stay away from things that are overly situational, where you need to be in a certain situation to use them effectively. So it's not a card that I carry in my decks. I don't consider it a very good card. Now, Cold Blood is actually something I've gained a lot more respect for in recent times. Cold Blood is basically a 1-cost Dark Iron Dwarf if you don't combo it. It gives your minion a +2 attack. Now, the cool thing with this card, though, is that it's not a temporary boost. It doesn't end at the end of the turn. And if you manage to combo this out, you're getting the +4 attack instead. It can be very powerful if used in the right times, and it can also give a cheap minion that extra boost it needs to take out a much larger minion. Of course, unlike a Dark Iron Dwarf, you're not getting the 4/4 follow-up minion on the board to use, but again, this is 1 cost opposed to the 4 cost of the Dark Iron. So I actually, I'm starting to have more faith in this card. I think it can be very useful in a lot of certain specific kinds of decks. So I would recommend this card, especially you know, aggro decks with cheap minions. If you need something to boost up those kind of cheap minions to be able to handle some of the larger stuff that comes out, I think it's a good option. Overall, it's a very solid card. Now, Sinister Strike is considered probably one of the worst cards in the Rogue deck. Typically, if I'm playing somebody and they throw a Sinister Strike on me, that's a pretty good sign that they're a new player and they're not very experienced. And most of the Hearthstone community agrees with this card pretty much kind of being on the trashy side of things. It's just, you know, you're getting that 3 damage on an enemy hero for 1 cost. It's just not all that valuable. You're better off having a card in there that's actually more utility, getting a creature on the field, or something that maybe can do some silence or damage or some removal. Doing 3 damage to an enemy hero just isn't that useful. So it's just considered a bad card. I wouldn't put it in my decks. I would save that spot for something much more useful. Conceal, 1 cost, it gives your minion stealth until next turn. Again, that's very situational. You know, if you're looking to get the killing blow maybe, and you want to conceal some of your minions to keep them from being removed, but again, it's not going to help them in a situation where they're using AoE damage. I think Conceal has a very kind of a limited usefulness. It's very situational, not a card I particularly run in any of my decks unless I was building a deck to somehow specifically make use of something like Conceal. You don't see it used very often in very many rogue decks. By and large, I think the community considers it a bad card, and so that's something I'd keep in mind there. Now let's see, I think we've covered most of these. I'm trying to think of anything else here we should cover. I guess we can go ahead and talk about Vanish and Sprint. Vanish is a 6 cost and returns all minions to their owner's hand. Again, this is it's kind of a slightly different version of the Warlock card, which destroys all the minions. I think it's Nether Vortex. This just puts them back in their hands. Now, I suppose you could use this card in a situation where you just need to buy some time. You're getting overwhelmed. It's going to have limited use against something like a Warlock fast aggro deck, like a Murloc deck or something, because even if you put all those cards back into their hand, they're so cheap that they're going to be able to play a lot of them out again the next turn, and they may even be able to play them in a worse fashion that ends up screwing you over a little more. So I would be very cautious when playing this card if you're going to run it. I don't particularly think it's a great card. I think it's very situational. It only has limited use, and it has absolutely no use if you control the minion board, and if you're winning the game, and this isn't a card that you're going to want to use. So then it basically nullifies the reason to even have it in your deck. I don't think it's a great card. I think it's a pretty bad card, especially at 6 cost. I don't carry them. I can't remember the last time when I've seen somebody play one. It's probably been a few months. Not a great card. Now, Sprint's kind of an interesting card. Problem is with Sprint is it costs 7 mana, but yes, it draws 4 cards. The problem with Sprint is that it's very hard to be able to be in a good situation where you have the ability to play it, because it's basically going to take almost your entire turn to play it. So if you play this around turn 7 or turn 8, you're not going to be able to do much after Sprint. So the problem that you really kind of have to juggle there is picking the right time to actually play it. Yeah, those 4 card draws can be very beneficial. It can help you seal the deal, kind of winning the game. But you also need to be in a position where you're not going to need to play anything else that turn other than Sprint. If you're already losing and you're behind and you're getting clobbered, typically Sprint isn't going to save you. You're basically also giving them a free turn to pummel you even more. So usually if I carry Sprint, I only carry 1. 2 is way overkill, don't do it. And I usually don't use it unless I am in a position where I have control of the minion board and I can get away with 1 turn of not putting any other minions on the board. Other than that, it's very situational to when you can use it, like I said, and definitely do not carry more than 1 in your deck. You'll be sorry. So I think that pretty much covers the basics of the rogues and most of the cards and how you should be using them, especially with the combo effects. I can, before I end this video, give you one quick example of a rogue deck that I actually like. Now this is based on one of Trump's decks. It's called This Is My Town, and he actually used this in a tournament. I can't remember the name of the tournament, but it's the one that Artosis hosts. And I believe I've made some changes in this. I believe he had a couple novice engineers in here, and because of the recent changes, I swapped those out for something else. I don't remember what. But this is a very fast deck. It plays a lot of minions very fast. It has some combo abilities. He doesn't use any assassinates in this deck, but I found that it plays very fast. It's good at just pounding your enemy turn after turn. Once you get some of these minions out, it kind of overwhelms them. And the nice thing about this deck overall is that, as you'll notice, there's no legendaries in it. It's a very easy deck to make once you start unlocking some of the more basic cards. A lot of the top end decks out there are kind of ridiculously priced with all of the legendaries that they tend to carry, especially at the top tier of constructed. So this is actually a deck that I've had very successful win rates with that's actually pretty cheap to put together. So it's something you might want to take a look at and give it a try. You know, just kind of give you a starting point to what to look for in putting together a rogue deck. So Again, that's the basics of the rogue and how they work, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next class now.